Welcome to Indus Special. I'm Ejaz Haider. A suicide attack by Adil Dar, a Kashmiri freedom fighter in occupied Kashmir's Pulwama district, killed 44 Central Reserve Police Force personnel of India, part of more than 500,000 security forces stationed in Kashmir to put down a 7-decade-old demand by Kashmiris for the right to self-determination. Dar was driving a vehicle laden with explosives and rammed his car into a CRPF bus, part of a 70-vehicle convoy transporting 2,500 troops. Predictably, Delhi accused Pakistan of being behind the attack, a charge categorically rejected by Pakistan. The Foreign Office spokesperson said that while the attack was a matter of grave concern, we strongly reject any insinuation by elements in Indian government and media circles that seek to link the attack to state of Pakistan without investigations. There have been at least 10 suicide attacks since 1989, but this is only the second suicide attack to use a car. Prior to Thursday's bombing, the deadliest attack on Indian security forces in Kashmir came in 2002, when 31 people at an army base in Kaluchak near Jammu were killed in an attack. At least 19 soldiers were also killed in an attack on an army base in Uri in 2016. India, obviously, has been parroting the terrorism mantra to move the scrutiny away from Kashmiris' right to self-determination, an inalienable right which is also enshrined in UN resolutions on the Kashmir dispute. Also, international law is very clear on the issue of armed struggle. A resolution 37/43 of 3rd December 1982 states, reaffirms the legitimacy of the struggle of peoples for independence, territorial integrity, national unity and liberation from colonial and foreign domination and foreign occupation by all available means, including armed struggle. Meanwhile, India has promised a fitting response, has withdrawn the MFN status for Pakistan and has activated its missions abroad to present its viewpoint. Indian PM Narendra Modi is facing a tough election ahead, and he'll drag Pakistan into this to exploit it politically for himself. To discuss the situation and possible Indian responses, we have with us Dr. Sikander Shah, an expert in international law who teaches at the Lahore University of Management Sciences. We have Mohammad Muzzamil, a Kashmiri analyst based in London. And we also have Mr. Gowhar Geelani, who is a journalist based in Srinagar. Let me begin with Dr. Shah. Sikander, what exactly is international law with reference to freedom struggles, the right to self-determination being a peremptory norm?
Yeah, I think you mentioned a resolution, a very important resolution, but this goes back to the time of the UN Charter. There are two provisions in the UN Charter, Article 1, 2 and Article 55, which recognize the right of self-determination of people. And this has been subsequently been reaffirmed in a number of Security Council and General Assembly resolutions. The two more, the famous ones are there's this one called GRS 1514, 1541 and Resolution 2625. These all recognize the right of self-determination, and as you correctly pointed out, there is nothing in international law which prohibits the use of force in trying to realize this right of self-determination. There have been attempts to conflate the right of self-determination with armed use of force with terrorism, and I think international law is now crystallizing to the extent that it's the way you use force that determines whether it's legal or illegal under IHL law, and also under laws that have been sort of promulgated to counter terrorism. But as long as you're complying with either regime or both, both regimes, then you are not in violation of international law.
So one of the things that we have noticed is, and I'm talking about this conflation. This conflation, you'd probably agree with me, began to sort of crystallize post 9/11 with a lot of narrative coming out of the US. But increasingly, in terms of the UN's definition of terrorism, it is about what kind of target you are selecting. And if the purpose is to willfully attack and kill soft targets and civilians, then that constitutes terrorism. But in this particular case, what we've seen is that this is a convoy of security personnel traveling on a road which is sanitized in order for them to move safely from one point to another. And on that road, this convoy was ambushed. So from every definition of an operation or an attack or an ambush, call it what you will, it seems like Dar targeted a hard target?
Yeah, I mean, I think that, and we need to focus on the international humanitarian law aspects of this, because we're looking at a conflict. It's an internal armed conflict or external armed conflict, depending on how you define it. Even if you're India, you look at it, there's definitely a conflict here. And when you have a conflict, you have two categories of people. You either have combatants or civilians, right? Yeah. And so there's no terrorist in this matrix. And if a combatant or a civilian, that is, uses force which is not in line with a combatant specifically with laws of war, then he commits a war crime. Now, looking at this particular incident, this particular person targeted military personnel. In fact, even if you end up killing civilians, as long as they're not the object of attack, which is not this is not really what's happened here, then there's additional protocol 1, which is customary law, which says as long as you don't make civilians the object of an attack, it is in line with laws of war. Then look at the way there was proportionality in terms of there was just targeting a particular military convoy. It was also, from this perspective, a military necessity, because you're looking at the asymmetry in warfare here. You can use force in this particular way. There was no feigning of like wearing someone else's uniform, trying to confuse the enemy. It was just using force as required under international law. And also, one thing I want to point out is that military personnel don't stop being military personnel if they're not fighting. They can be targeted in messes if there's a conflict going on. There's a category in international law called actively engaged in hostilities. Yes. And because, we know this, that, in World War II and subsequently, when military installations are targeted, where military personnel are not actively at that point in time engaging in warfare, correct, they can be targeted.
They can be targeted. Muzzamil, semantics are important. Words are important because they form narratives. Now, one of the things that we have seen is India moving the issue constantly away from the right to self-determination and talking about quote-unquote terrorism, especially post 9/11. We also, in terms of how we define the Kashmiris who are fighting against the security forces, are they freedom fighters, are they militants, or, as India says, terrorists? So give me a sense of what the Kashmiris think about these semantics, and also what your view is about the attack that happened yesterday.
I think you're right. Language is very, very important. The way that India's narrative is that anybody that picks up a weapon, be it a stone or be it a gun, against the so-called security forces, what we call occupational forces, the best answer for that is when our freedom fighters are martyred and they're killed and they are taken to their burial sites, the amount of people that exist to go to these janazas, to go to these funerals, are in the tens of thousands, if not the hundreds of thousands. That in itself is an answer for India, whether these people that are taking up weapons are terrorists or they're freedom fighters, whether they have the support of the civilian population or not. The attack that has happened on the military convoy, it's a failure on India's part. It's a great answer from the population of Kashmir that are online condemning the continued occupation of Kashmir from the military perspective, from the political perspective, and from the narrative that exists, not just from the political stratosphere, but also from the media houses in India and the way that they're reporting. I want to remind you that there have been attacks on civilians, on Kashmiri civilians in Jammu, because of the snow that has been a heavy amount of snow in Kashmir. So a lot of people are stuck in Jammu. And the Hindus there, they've turned this into a communal issue. The Hindus there have been trying to lynch the Kashmiris, trying to abuse the Kashmiris, trying to hurt the Kashmiris. And that news has not traveled to mainstream India, to mainstream news channels in India. However, this attack has. That is a form of terrorism for them. But what the anti-Kashmiri people are doing, the attacks that are happening on the people of Kashmir, and not because of political speech, just because they happen to be Muslims. Those people are continuously attacked, and they are called terrorists. They are called anti-nationalists. An anti-nationalist is somebody that is part of India, part of a country. It is as your legal expert has said, Sikander Shah has said, this is a disputed territory. There can never be language that can be used for the people of Kashmir as separatists. The use of the word separatist in itself is illegal. This narrative after 9/11, we also have to remember people like the Taliban were entertained by the governments of America and other countries, invited to the White House to discuss, to talk. But in our case, unfortunately, after 9/11, the entire scenario has changed, language has changed, metaphors have changed, and we are portrayed as some kind of
there's need to push back. There's need to bring the categories back into the narrative, because I think that's something one doesn't need to be neutral about this, because if there is support from international law, it's not a subjective matter. International law has been thought about, conceptualized, formulated, presented, in and through various fora. So therefore, I think it's important to bring the right terminology back into this narrative. But let me go to Gowhar Geelani in Srinagar. What is the situation right now? Can you give me a sense of, this whole talk about befitting response? I'm assuming that there will be further repression in Srinagar and other parts of the valley. What is the sense that you have of the situation?
Mr. Ejaz, thank you for inviting me in your program. Yes, of course. I mean, I have been on your program before as well. And this has been the policy of Narendra Modi-led government. If you see, you're talking about the semantics, language, terminology, vocabulary. The operation that was, started in Jammu and Kashmir by government forces is named as Operation All Out.
Correct.
And you see, if there's a claim by Delhi that Kashmir remains an integral part, so how can an Operation All Out be started against your so-called own people, quote unquote? So if you see the statistics from 2014 onwards, when Narendra Modi was elected to government in Delhi, there have been more than 2,000 killings, and most of them civilians and also armed rebels who are mostly untrained, who are not well trained, they're not battle hardened, they don't go across to receive arms training, as was the case in the 90s. And even in this case, for example, we have had a snowfall. It has been one of the harshest winters in Jammu and Kashmir for nearly more than 2 decades. And the first snowfall was witnessed on the 3rd of November. Then there was snowfall in December, January, even in February. In the first week of February, the highway which connects Srinagar to Jammu was closed for 8 consecutive days. So the talk about infiltration does not arise. So this is a local boy who has done this, and people can condemn it, people can appreciate it depending on which side of the fence they are. But the larger question is, how can a Kashmiri boy who is as young as 20-year-old, and be able to do this kind of an act? It's an act of desperation, because for all these 5 years, the kind of dissent has been choked. The peaceful assemblies have been choked. The only peaceful assembly that Kashmiris have access to are the funerals of local boys being killed, who are being lowered into the grave by their fragile fathers, and mothers are wailing on their graves. And that is the only place, funerals, where people can assemble actually. Otherwise, there are internet downs, there are curfews, there are clampdowns. Even today, when this attack happened yesterday, is sanitized. South Kashmir, the entire 4 districts of South Kashmir, internet is shut down. So we fear, because it's election time, this attack perfectly suits the Hindutva narrative of the BJP, and internally, in India, wants to showcase that it is a victim of so-called terrorism, and it was on a back foot, and there were reports that Narendra Modi might lose the elections. So that's why all the talk is against Pakistan, summoning the High Commissioner or withdrawal of the most favored nation status. So internationally as well, the New Delhi is to play the victim card. They will not tell what they have done in the last 5 years, but they will pick and choose their stories to have the main contention as the narrative of victimhood. So that is the sorry state of affairs.
Absolutely, that is where language it becomes so important. But Sikander, since this whole talk about terrorism and of course the states have become one of the most important organizing principle and a unit of analysis. and we talk about the world states and interstate relations and the rest of it. And we also differentiate the states from non-state actors. And part of the narrative is that the states can attack, the states can also kill. If the civilians get killed, that's collateral damage. And the argument is that the states do not particularly target civilians. That's not the intention. Even though, let us not forget that under what is, as you remember, under the just war theory, the emergency ethics, it was the British Bomber Command in Second World War that decided to actually bomb German cities and kill German civilians. That was part of emergency ethics. My point is that in 2005, there was a World Summit where the member states endorsed the fact, that if states are not responsible enough internally, where there's genocide, with war crimes and the rest of it, that there can be a case made for intervening in those circumstances. So give me a sense of what international law says about state oppression, and where do you draw the line in terms of the line that a state can cross and where it begins to act in a way that is simply unacceptable?
That's a great question. It's a very complicated question because you have different bodies of law intersecting at this point on this issue. There have been doctrines, as you pointed out. There's something called responsibility to protect doctrine, which was used to target Libya, and was nearly used to basically invade Syria, and that was because of Russian and Chinese hesitancy that didn't go through. But there's always, historically, there's been this doctrine of humanitarian intervention, which hasn't really made it to customary law. But I think these are political decisions, and that's why international law has to have some form of balance, because you have territorial sovereignty and integrity, which basically are.
So it is.
Right.
So it works horizontally. It's not.
Right.
It's not vertical, because it's not like domestic law.
Right.
And consent and sovereignty are two of those conditions that determine how far a state can be made to go as far as international law is concerned.
Yeah, and also there are internal mechanisms, as I was saying. So, for example, there's something called the right of internal self-determination. If a particular state, and I'm not using the case of Kashmir here because Kashmir has the right of self-determination, it's been established, it was an independent sovereign territory at the point of independence. But even within a state, and there have been cases, both domestic cases and international law cases, that if a country keeps on suppressing a particular ethnicity or people, eventually they have that right graduates into a right of external self-determination. So, there's a balance, but keep in mind that terrorism is a very political doctrine, even in international law. And that's why initially when I was talking about IHL law, international humanitarian law, it's not political, it's based on hard law.
Okay. We are also joined by Neha Poonia, who's a journalist based in Delhi. Ms. Poonia, thank you for being on the program. Delhi has promised a befitting response to Pakistan post an attack mounted by a local Kashmiri boy. What is your sense of where things are or where they might go from here?
To answer your question, is this about politics? You're right in saying that India is in election mode. Prime Minister Modi is seeking a re-election for another 5 terms in just about a few months from now. I would say that, yes, there's a lot of pressure on Prime Minister Modi because there was a commitment that he had made before coming to power in 2014 that he would bring insurgency to an end in Kashmir. But if you speak to experts in New Delhi, like I have...
Through sheer use of force? Because during his tenure, we haven't seen much in terms of reaching out politically. For instance, there's a huge contrast in what he has done in Kashmir and what Mr. Vajpayee, the late Mr. Vajpayee, had tried to do. So when you say that he promised to put down the insurgency, and I might add here for good measure that this is not just an insurgency, this is a demand for the right to self-determination. Whether India agrees with it or not is a separate issue altogether. So what has this government done in terms of reaching out to the Kashmiris except repressing them or blinding them or torturing them or killing them?
Mr. Haider, if this is something that you put to the Indian government, they will disagree.
No, I'm simply asking you because you as a journalist, as a respected journalist who looks at these things, I need to get your view on this. Of course, I'm not asking you to speak on behalf of the Indian government. I wouldn't even expect you to speak on behalf of the Indian government.
No, and it's not something that I could do or even would claim to do, Mr. Haider, which is why I would say that, yes, there's unrest on the ground. This has been around since 1989.
Unrest is a euphemism. I mean, it's like Noah said, it's about to rain.
But Mr. Haider, I'm not going to squabble with you over this because clearly...
No, that's not about squabbling. It's about the use of words. Both of us use words, and we know that words are very important.
I know, but I can only... Yes, I know, but I'm not going to call this what you're calling it. I'm going to simply report on facts as they're stated by the Indian government, and I hope you're okay with it because that's what I bring to the
I'm
table
perfectly
here.
fine. That's your view, which is why you were here, and I want to hear your view.
No, and I'm bringing you a perspective from across the border, so I would really appreciate if you'd let me speak in my own language without attributing words that I should or shouldn't use. I don't think that would be fair to either side of the audience tuning in from either side.
Go ahead. Go ahead.
So, Mr. Haider, to answer your question, what has the Modi government done? Well, if you ask them, they have said that they've reached out to the youth. They have carried out various outreach programs. But if you speak to the opposition, they will disagree. Something along the lines of what you're saying. They will say not enough has been done. Yes, there has been increased use of force over the last 4 years because one of the hallmarks of Prime Minister Modi's promise of clamping down on insurgency in the state, as the government views it, was to give more power to the security forces. This is something that's made the residents of Jammu and Kashmir very unhappy. We've seen a lot of protests over the last 4 years, a lot of unrest. As we've seen, a lot of instances, especially after Burhan Wani's death, where there were very violent clashes between the civilians and security forces. And sadly, that's the narrative playing out in Jammu and Kashmir. You've had the United Nations also comment on this, saying that human rights are being suppressed. But of course, the government says that that is not true, that they're simply sort of dealing with the situation at hand. And yes, they've blamed Pakistan for this repeatedly. They've also made efforts to strengthen the border to try and stop what they call infiltration of terror groups from across the border. But to simply answer your question about elections that are coming up, does it look like Prime Minister Modi has done enough in terms of dealing with the situation at hand? Locals will say no. His party will say yes. The opposition will say no. Certainly, he's on very tricky ground if we only look at the elections that are coming up.
Absolutely. Stay with me, Ms. Poonia. I'm just going to go across to Gowhar Geelani in Srinagar, again, a journalist. Mr. Geelani, you heard Ms. Poonia, who's a journalist based in Delhi. Let me ask you, is there a difference in perspective in terms of the view from Srinagar of the situation on the ground and the view from Delhi of the situation on the ground?
Of course, there's a huge difference. I can actually understand what Neha is trying to say. She's trying to speak from what the BJP is saying, what the Congress is saying. But of course, there's a different narrative on the ground in Jammu and Kashmir, and what the Indian government calls terrorism or Pakistan-sponsored a movement in Jammu and Kashmir is not what the Kashmiris would say on the ground. There are like 50,000 people, 250,000 people participated in the funeral of Burhan Wani, who India calls a terrorist. So even this boy who just did this attack yesterday, there are thousands of people who have gathered at his home. So that is the narrative in Jammu and Kashmir. It's a very different narrative, and the choice of words. For example, the United Nations used in its report, in its damning report, condemning the Indian, the words it used was a brutal force used by security forces against the defenseless population of Jammu and Kashmir, and how they indulged in extrajudicial killings and how they blinded a generation in Kashmir. So that is what the UN said. It's not any Kashmiri, any Gowhar Geelani or anybody else saying. So even that report was rejected by the BJP government, saying that it's motivated, it's malicious. So there's a huge difference, difference between what people in Delhi say and what people in Srinagar say. right on the ground, for example, if you have seen what has happened in the last 5 years, as I was pointing out earlier, there has been belligerence from the New Delhi government. There has been excessive use of force against women. As young as 18-month-old, I'm not saying 18 years, 18-month-old Hiba Jan, whose eye was hit by the pellets, and there have been women who have been killed. There have been young boys, teenagers who have been lowered into the grave because of the excessive force used by the Indian security forces in Jammu and Kashmir. So clearly, when that is not terrorism, for example, people on the street are saying when 700,000 contingent of Indian armed forces who are acting with impunity with AFSPA, Armed Forces Special Powers Act, and using pellet shotguns to maim and blind a generation in Kashmir. So when that is not terrorism and you call it, we are defending a territory, and why for 250 odd militants who are mostly locals, who have not crossed over to the other side to receive arms training, who are not battle hardened, who do not know how to use the gun. So for 250 odd boys who are locals from South Kashmir and North Kashmir, why would you use 700,000 armed forces? And you have been, BJP government has many a time claimed that infiltration has come down to zero. So why would then, right now, because it suits your narrative, so it's easy to blame somebody else. But this is a local boy. Yeah. I have been writing on this, that because the political space has been choked to such an extent that people who actually call for dialogue, voices like us who always call, take lessons from the East Timor, Northern Ireland model, East Timor model, or even the Afghanistan Taliban talks, and this Kashmir dispute will be resolved on the table. But the voices like us are sidelined because there is every violence suits parties like the BJP, which want to they want to give fillip to the Hindutva narrative, and there have been lynchings, mob lynchings in mainland India against the marginalized communities, including Muslims mostly. So that is the kind of narrative which Delhi wants to play and play the victim card when it is the aggressor in Jammu and Kashmir. So from a Kashmiri perspective, it is Delhi is the aggressor, and Delhi is the aggressor, and Islamabad, and there have been appeals from Srinagar for both Islamabad and Delhi that please come onto the table. Kashmiris are the victims in this hegemonic narratives from both countries, and they want a solution, peaceful solution for their next generations. They don't want their fourth generation to suffer that the way they have in the last 70 years, and more so in last 30 years, and now since the Modi government that has taken over in Delhi in 2014, May 2014.
Okay, I'm going to take a break. Please meet me at the other end of the break. We will continue discussing this. Stay with us. Welcome back to Indus Special. We're discussing the attack yesterday on a CRPF convoy and, of course, India's accusation that Pakistan is behind this attack. Muzzamil, you heard Gowhar Geelani, you heard Neha Poonia. What would you say? Because I continue to insist that the language, the words, the images that we use are very important in building narratives. The fact that India claims that Kashmir is its part, the fact that India claims that Kashmiris are Indians, and yet we see that when Afzal Guru is put to death, he is just buried in the Tihar jail. These are important reminders of what kind of narrative is trotted out, and the fact that the Kashmiris' right to self-determination is completely ignored, buried deep inside this narrative.
Gowhar alluded to this, that in terms of the young boys, 20-year-old boys that are carrying out these acts, you see the language, it suits India. It suits the narrative from Delhi to portray the Kashmiris in a particular light, or to use the words such as insurgency and terrorism. But let's talk about it in detail. Let's think about in terms of insurgency. When India's own army say that insurgency no longer exists, or it is very minimal, and when we see the martyrs in Kashmir, we see the armed rebels that are fighting against the occupation, when we see who they are, they're all local boys. There is no insurgency. This language must stop from these. It suits their narrative. And let's be clear. Let's even allude to this fact that it could be potentially, because of the upcoming elections, it's very likely that it could have been a false flag operation. Why not? Why can we not talk about this? It could very likely be a false flag operation. And the language in terms of terror, they have alluded that terror is only from the people of Kashmir, and what their own army is doing is completely justified. Why? Because of the draconian laws that exist. As Gowhar said, the Armed Forces Special Powers Act, the PSA Act, and whatnot. When they use pellets against children in as young as 18 months, as Gowhar said, or bullets, killing people, not above as international law states. If the last resort is weapons such as bullets, it has to be used above the waist. In Kashmir, below the waist, my mistake, below the waist. Without any prosecution, with impunity, these armed forces. The biggest problem is, as you said, is the language that is used, because that rhetoric is then repeated internationally. Now, people in the West would listen to India because of the economic power that it holds, because of the position, the physical, geographical position that it holds, and the need that the West has. So coming from the UK, I'll tell you that the British government refused to say anything against India because of the looming Brexit issue. The fact that the UK will be leaving the European Union, therefore economic ties with India are very, very important. But at the same time, allies, for example, Pakistan, but beyond that, let's talk about Turkey. I recently, just this morning, read a statement from Turkey condemning the so-called terror attack. Now, this language that our own allies use, and Turkey have been a great supporter of the Kashmir cause for right to self-determination and the human rights issues that are happening there. But this narrative that India has been pushing around for the last umpteen years, for God knows how many years, has now started to filter through NGOs, international organizations, foreign offices all around the world. It is the responsibility of not just Pakistan, but also those Kashmiris, the diaspora Kashmiris that are living outside of Kashmir, to propagate the actual narrative, the language that must be used, because those that we have to recognize, those that are currently living inside Kashmir, face a threat. It doesn't matter whether you are a journalist, whether you are an armed resistance leader, whether you are the Hurriyat themselves. Everybody faces a threat. On social media, in person, you cannot say anything, you cannot do anything without being not only condemned, but arrested or killed. There is a serious threat. So therefore, there is a massive responsibility on those that are
I get your perspective,
outside.
Muzzamil. Yeah, I get your perspective. Thank you so much for giving us your view. I'm also joined by Ambassador Zamir Akram. Ambassador Akram, you've seen what happened in occupied Kashmir yesterday, and of course India's response, and the Foreign Office response that this insinuation is rejected. What would you say? I mean, what are the possibilities? What could India possibly do, quite apart from the diplomatic offensive and the rest of it? What can they possibly do?
I think in the worst case, what the Indians can do is to try out some kind of a surgical strike that they tried to do last time, which wasn't much of a surgical strike, but they may do something like this to satisfy domestic opinion and to show Mr. Modi that he's a robust and strong leader. So that's the kind of thing that we should be ready for from the Indian side. Other than that, what they are threatening, this diplomatic isolation and things like that, I thought they had already succeeded in isolating us, which they didn't. But that is not something that works. You can't isolate Pakistan. It has too many other equities and too many other countries have interest with Pakistan. So I think that's the kind of thing that we see in the immediate response. But I think that the more important thing is that the Indians should wake up to the reality that they need to find a political solution to the problem in Kashmir. And
Okay.
for that, they need to have a dialogue with us, and they need to have a dialogue with the Kashmiris themselves.
Absolutely. Thank you so much. That was Ambassador Zamir Akram. Neha Poonia, let me ask you this. Disengagement is never really a viable policy in interstate relations. No matter what, states need to continue to talk to each other. That has not happened ever since Mr. Modi came in. There have been attempts. In fact, there's also been criticism in the Indian media itself of taking a step forward and then, taking 2 steps backward. What is your sense of what exactly Mr. Modi's Pakistan policy has been?
Well, I think it started off on the right note, Mr. Haider, when you had Nawaz Sharif being invited for his swearing-in ceremony in 2014. I think that was a very big moment, both in terms of optics and in terms of Mr. Modi starting off on a clean slate. But since then, like you said, things have rapidly deteriorated.
Let me take you back to that 2014 thing that you talked about. You know, I'm sure, or maybe I have to jog your memory here, that the very next day, there was a disconnect, a huge disconnect, in the sense that our side was thinking in terms of a joint presser, whereas the Indian side had arranged something completely different. And you know, here in Pakistan, we criticized the PMLN government's delegation, saying that, you know, you guys didn't really do your homework, you've ended with egg on your face. So there was a huge disconnect, even at that time.
You know, this is something that we saw on the Indian side as well. When you had Prime Minister Modi going to Nawaz Sharif's hometown, meeting his family members, there was a similar reaction in India as well, with everyone saying, why are you reaching out to Pakistan? You know, and when I say everyone, I mean people in the right-wing parties mostly, saying, why are you reaching out to Pakistan when they haven't reciprocated to any of our moves? So I think sentiment on both sides runs quite high, Mr. Haider, whenever we're dealing with one another, especially for those people who are expecting a lot out of small moments. And I want to stress on this, because as far as India's engagement with Pakistan is concerned and vice versa, we've honestly not made any headway at all that's substantial in the last 5 years. And that's where the problem is. We've come to the table many times. The NSAs of both countries met during Prime Minister Modi's tenure as well, where there was an understanding that they were both at least willing to have an engagement to discuss things, including Kashmir. But we saw how that broke down in the backdrop of the Uri attack in 2016. So I think that's where the problem is. Any engagement has been focused more on optics and less on substantial sort of issues that need to be discussed on a government-to-government basis. We've not seen any successful track to engagements as well, which essentially are the backbone for any kind of diplomatic engagement. We had that in the run-up to the NSA talks that took place out of both India and Pakistan. But since then, there's been nothing. You've got experts on both sides saying, look, you need to sit down, discuss this. It's a question of people, you know, who are upset, who are being targeted. And that's unconscionable. Like for either country to be involved in something like this, and like you said, it is the people who are paying the price. Even in the aftermath of this entire horrific attack that took place in Pulwama, it's the people that are at the center of anyone's concern, because now the government has said that the security forces will be given a free rein. What does that mean? Does that mean we'll see more forces deployed to Kashmir? Is that really something that will solve the problem? These are questions we need to ask.
And these are important questions, because let's assume a scenario, which is that given the complexity of India-Pakistan relations, there will always be spoilers. Now, should the two states, or one state, in this case the bigger one, India, actually walk a path where engagement becomes hostage to the spoilers, or to actually take a decision and say, well, no matter what happens, this is the stage where we need to traverse, have an uninterrupted and uninterruptible dialogue, so that we can get to a point where we can, where there's enough confidence building, where we can actually begin to talk meaningfully and substantively about things.
Mr. Haider, I'd pose the same question to you. I mean, even if India were to say yes, do you think that commitment would come from Pakistan? And I'm not speaking here as an Indian national. I'm simply raising a rhetorical question as a journalist. And I'm sure you'd agree with me that the problem isn't with one side. Sadly, both governments, irrespective of Nawaz Sharif, Imran Khan, Narendra Modi, Manmohan Singh, we've been very high on rhetoric while dealing with each other. So, I mean, even if one country, even if Pakistan were to say, okay, let's hold engagements with India, irrespective of what happens.
No, for instance, okay. So, Pakistani side, when Prime Minister Imran Khan was sworn in, Mr. Sidhu was here. He talked about the Kartarpur Sahib corridor. Mr. Sidhu went back, was savagely attacked by various quarters, including some people in the media. Ultimately, I think Delhi came round not because it wanted to engage with Pakistan. As a matter of fact, it's been invoking all sorts of technicalities ever since, but for the simple reason that because it is an emotive religious issue for the Sikhs, so Delhi didn't want to come across as cussed in the entire matter. So I think there has been, and I'm insisting on this, because I see, I've been watching the Indian governments for a long time. There's an occupational hazard. But this particular government's approach has always given me a sense that it's not really interested in any substantive dialogue with Pakistan.
A lot of people actually in India would agree with you, Mr. Haider, on that count, that when it comes to engaging with Pakistan, the government has often been accused of having a very flip-flop kind of policy. When you pose that question to the government, they say, our hands are tied. Well, we don't want to have any kind of engagement at a time when the phrase that's often used is terror and talks can't go together, something that Gowhar referred to as well. And we can keep discussing this, but I think the problem here is that even when it comes to Imran Khan saying that I want to hold dialogue with the Indian government, the same Imran Khan, before coming to power on his campaign rallies, had also attacked Nawaz Sharif for reaching out and holding talks with Modi. So there is inconsistency on both sides of the border when it comes to
there is domestic politicking, obviously. I mean, both of us are just so we know. I mean, that's how the domestic politics basically plays out. But it is also, a matter of empirical evidence that in Pakistan, the election campaigns are not built on some kind of adversarial, conflictual model with India. I mean, they're mostly about our domestic affairs. But in India, it's been the other way around very often.
It has been, and it's not just limited to this government. In fact, Pakistan is an issue that many parties have invoked while campaigning, and that's tragic. I mean, but it also tells you something, that the fact that this was one of the promises that Prime Minister Modi made, that he's being held accountable to now, tells you it's more than just sort of politicking. It's more than just
he has also gotten into what in strategy we call the commitment trap, and that's never a nice place to be in. But thank you so much, Neha Poonia, for giving us your insights. I'm grateful. Sikander, we have to wrap up also. So give me a sense of, you heard Neha Poonia. There's domestic politicking, there's all sorts of things happening. So I'm not asking you in particular with reference to international law, but more the politics of the entire thing.
I mean, I have two comments because I've been listening to all the people on the show, and they've all said some interesting stuff. The first thing I want to talk about, because the narrative component is very important, is to talk about law, right? Law is a form of narrative, and we should use it. So, for example, when India is saying that, JEM is involved and Pakistan is supporting it, there is international law, which says even unless you have state sponsorship across the border, you cannot violate the sovereignty of another nation. So that kind of jargon rhetoric has to be condemned. Secondly, when India, and Neha also pointed this out, that this might not be good for civilians because there could be reprisals. Well, reprisals are unlawful under international law. We need to talk about that, right? Pellet guns, that is unnecessary suffering. That's a weapon prohibited in conflict. That is in violation of international law. So my point would be, my rebuke would be on Pakistan in the sense that they are indecisive. The Foreign Office talked about we condemn violence. Well, in armed conflict, there is violence. We have to understand this is a movement of self-determination. We have to understand that as a responsible nation, agreed, we don't violate sovereignty of other nations, but we can't be condemning violence and talking about it's a grave concern for us because we have a Kashmiri policy. And our policy, the Kashmiris have a right of self-determination. And I can tell you that in international law, there are instances where other nations in an armed fashion support other countries.
As a matter of fact, there are UN resolutions, there's 2625 or whatever, I don't exactly remember the number, where it actually says that freedom fighters in an armed struggle can call upon allies.
That's why that can become into an international armed conflict. You wouldn't have that definition unless that wasn't allowed. So I think we need to talk about narrative, but we need to stick to the narrative, which is a universal narrative. As you pointed out, these laws just didn't come out of nowhere. They've been formed because of conflict, and at this point in time, the law is on Kashmir's side. It's as simple as that.
Absolutely, and I think we need to also go on a diplomatic offensive here and ensure that the correct terminologies and words and language is used. Gowhar Geelani, last word to you, sir.
Mr. Ejaz, well, I listened to all the and some very good important points, but I just want to go back to what Mr. Modi's government has done, because when it introduced demonetization, for example, so it was a disaster. Demonetization was a disaster. It had promised people that it will bring back black money from foreign countries. Nothing happened that front. So the only issues which remained for Mr. Modi were Pakistan, Kashmir, and on Kashmir's domestic turf, we have this DDA, Disturbed Area Act, DAA, imposed since January 1990. We have Public Safety Act, in which a person can be prosecuted for years. Now it has been reduced for 6 months. He can be held behind bars without trial. And AFS is there since Armed Forces Special Powers Act since 90s. So all these, and Operation All Out, as I was referring to, Operation All Out against whom? If India's claim is it's our territory and Kashmiris are our own people, so why do you need Operation All Out?
Absolutely. If they are your own people, then you shouldn't have an Operation All Out. That was Gowhar Geelani from Srinagar, a journalist giving us his perspective. Thank you so much, Dr. Sikander Shah. This is all for today. From Indus Special, we shall see you next week. Until then, it's goodbye.